These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Why do we study chess tactics? Why tactics? If you have played chess at all, you know it is easy for the two sides to trade pieces. Your knight takes my bishop, my pawn takes your knight, and we're even. But if your knight takes my bishop and I can't capture your knight, you gain an edge that probably will be decisive. If one player has more pieces than the other, he usually wins without much trouble. Between good players, a one-piece advantage is enough to cause the disadvantaged party to resign. Thus the most important moments in a chess game generally occur when you take one of your opponent's pieces and he gets nothing back, or vice versa. So how does it happen that one side takes another side's pieces for free? Between beginners, the common answer is that you wait for your opponent to blunder by leaving a piece unguarded, then you just take it and hope you aren't the one to blunder first. Chess games that go this way aren't terribly interesting, and they make it hard to understand what all the fuss over the game is about. The fuss arises because there are moves you can make that force your opponent to cough up pieces unexpectedly. All his men look safe, but then you play a knight fork, a move in which your knight attacks two of his pieces at once. He only has time enough, one turn, to move or protect one of them, so you take the other for free. It's all very satisfying, and it's even better when you first capture his bishop, and he recaptures, then you check his king, and it moves, and then you play the knight fork, winning a piece. What makes this so pleasing is that you've planned the fork and forced your opponent to step into it by playing a few initial moves that forced his replies. These sequences, the little clusters of moves that win your opponent's pieces, are known, again, as tactics. A tactical sequence generally is a short bunch of moves that wins material, pieces or pawns, or that forces checkmate. Such a sequence also is known as a combination. Some people quarrel over the distinction between tactics and combinations. We won't. Now there also are other types of moves you can make in chess that aren't meant to win any pieces. Indeed, during a game you often will have no way to play one of those nifty tactical sequences, so you instead try to improve your position. You put your pieces onto squares where they have more room to move or are aimed at a part of the board where you are trying to put together an attack, or you move your pieces around to fend off your opponent's attempts to launch attacks of his own. This sort of play is called strategic. You are working toward general, long-term goals, and perhaps laying the groundwork for a tactical strike of the sort described a moment ago. When you make these sorts of moves, you may well not be seeing many moves ahead. You just are arranging your pieces the way you like, and your opponent is doing the same. Since you aren't making any immediate threats, your opponent is free to go about his business in ways that may be hard for you to predict. Strategy and tactics both are important, but tactics are more important. If you're a whiz at finding clever moves that take your opponent's pieces, you will be a terrifying opponent, have a good time playing chess, and win lots of games regardless of whether you know a great deal about strategy. If you're a whiz at strategy but not much good at tactics, you will have trouble winning or having fun because your pieces will keep getting taken. You certainly want to know something of strategy. You need ideas about what you can do with your pieces that will create eventual tactical opportunities for them. We will talk about it along the way. The point is just comparative. If you want satisfaction, you had best start by learning how to play tactics, how to spot and execute sequences of moves that allow you to take your opponent's pieces. What was said about strategy can be said as well about openings. You can spend enormous time mastering the details of an opening, say, the Italian game or the French defense. The yield of those efforts, in victories and in fun, probably will be small. You frequently will find that your opponent's play drags you away from the opening you studied, and even if not, the payoff of a successful opening usually is a minor advantage in position. By itself, the advantage will not win you anything or bring you much pleasure. What will bring you immense pleasure, whether or not you know much about openings, is taking your opponent's pieces. And to do that you need to learn how to use tactics, the weaponry of the chessboard. All this advice assumes you are not a strong player already. Once the material on this site is behind you, close study of openings and subtler points of strategy will make better sense. One false move in the opening and your goose is cooked if you are playing Garry Kasparov, but this is a site mostly for novices, so if you are reading it you probably should not be planning to play Kasparov anytime soon. You should be planning to play others of at least roughly your own strength, probably friends who are casual players, or opponents at the local chess club or on the internet. If you keep playing you will move on to better players, but it still will be a long while before a deep study of openings really pays off. In the meantime, all of your opponents, even the strong ones, will give you plenty of tactical opportunities. They will commit oversights that allow you to play pretty combinations and win pieces if you are sharp enough to see the chances for them. Acquiring this sharpness has nothing to do with memorization. It's a skill you gain by learning what clues signal that a combination may be possible, and by studying how to turn those clues into ideas that work. Why another book about chess tactics? Why another book about them? Since tactics are the most entertaining and important part of chess, it comes as no surprise that there have been many books written about them. This site, which amounts to another book, and not a short one, thus requires a few words of justification. It differs from all the prior work in several important respects. Most books about chess tactics follow one of two patterns. Some describe important tactical ideas, forks, pins, etc., and explain their logic a bit, then provide perhaps a dozen examples of how each tactic works. The other sort of book presents pages of diagrammed problems for the reader to solve. The answers usually are given in the back with minimal commentary. Both types of books are valuable, especially when used together, but I long have felt there was a place for a different approach. This project attempts to fill the gap. Its distinctive features can be summarized as follows: many examples, carefully organized. This site goes into greater detail than other books do in explaining each type of tactic and how to overcome the various obstacles that can arise in trying to make it work. There are about 80 knight forks here, for example, and they are broken down according to the different ways the tactic can look when it is lurking 2 or 3 moves away on an apparently placid chessboard. It may be that the square your knight needs is guarded but that the guard can be taken. It may be that the piece you want to fork is not very valuable but can be exchanged for a more valuable piece. It may be that you do not yet have a knight fork but that after you check the enemy king a forking possibility will come into view. All of these possibilities, and many others, are illustrated with about a half dozen explanations apiece and sometimes more. The process is repeated for all the major tactical motifs. There are more than 100 queen forks, more than 300 pins, nearly 200 discovered attacks, all subdivided into different ways. Each of these ideas can look when it is a couple of moves away from perfection. This method of organization makes it easier to learn in a systematic way about tactics and the issues that come up in using them. Every idea is shown in several contexts so that it will sink in and the persistent features of the pattern become familiar to you. And the many examples of each complication also will make it easier to recognize patterns during your games. You will start to sense that the position on the board almost resembles a recognizable pattern and almost lends itself to a known tactical theme. Then you can experiment with forcing moves, example checks, and captures that require predictable replies from your opponent, to make it work. The idea guides the experimentation. But to have the idea in the first place, to see, for example, that conditions on the board suggest a possible knight fork, even if the exact means of getting there has yet to be worked out, you need a repertoire of known tactical patterns that can be stimulated by the positions you see. The patterns studied here, in all their little variations, are meant to go into the reader's store of visual knowledge and become the basis of useful intuitions and ideas. Trains of thought explained. Chess tactics tend to involve the use of certain root ideas, cognitive riffs that get repeated and combined in various ways. The explanations here are meant to explain and reinforce those ideas so they become a natural part of your thought process at the board. Here is a slightly larger statement of the point. The quality of your chess is determined by the quality of your train of thought when deciding what move to make. The train of thought may be partly verbal, partly visual, or partly intuitive, but in any case it will involve a sequence in which you consider candidate moves and their pros and cons. The climb from novice to something better largely is a move from meandering, unsystematic trains of thought to more methodical and fruitful ones. For the beginner it therefore is helpful to see more than just a list of the correct moves that solve a chess problem. It helps to hear what questions one might have asked to spot the pattern and discover the correct moves for oneself. Thus every example here is accompanied by commentary explaining not just the right moves but a train of thought that leads from the position to its solution. The trains of thought offered in the commentaries emphasize the use of clues, signs to search for during your games that indicate a tactic might be available. The explanations show how the same sets of questions, some of them simple, can generate impressive tactical ideas when they are asked and answered methodically. Some trains of thought thus are repeated many times. The repetition would be inexcusable if the purpose of the project were just to transmit information, for then once would be enough. But the purpose is otherwise. It is to help change your mental habits at the board, and for this purpose an extra measure of clarity and some repetition both are helpful. This project especially is meant for those who like explanations in words. Not everyone does. Some students of chess prefer just diagrams with lists of the moves required to solve them. But I suspect that those who do think best in words will find it helpful, more interesting, easier to understand, and more likely to improve their play to have the solutions to problems explained out in English. These are matters of taste, and you, gentle reader, may not think the world really needs more words about chess. But if you do share this sense of mine, and have not found that most books about chess explain it in a way that speaks to you or affects your play, perhaps this site will change your relationship to the game. What is the double threat? The elements of tactics, a primer. The double threat. If you are new to chess, the sequences that good players use to win games may seem impossibly complicated. But most of them actually are based on just a few general concepts combined ingeniously and persistently. This frame and the ones that follow explain the concepts broadly. The rest of the site teaches their use in detail. The most important idea in chess is the double threat. Generally speaking, a double threat is any move you make that presents your opponent with two problems at the same time. Since each player can make just one move per turn, your opponent only has time to address one of the threats you have made. On your next turn you execute the other one. Maybe your first move checks his king and attacks another of his pieces at the same time, or maybe you threaten one of his pieces and are building a threat of checkmate elsewhere. The result is the same. Your opponent has to spend his next move dealing with your threat against his king, and then you get to take the other piece you were threatening. The universe of chess tactics can be divided into 4 or 5 great families of ideas, each of them a variation on the logic of the double threat. This site is organized around them. 1. The first family, and the best known type of double threat, is the fork, a move where one of your pieces attacks two enemy pieces at the same time. You no doubt have seen examples of knight forks if you have played chess for a while. The knight naturally lends itself to moves in which it attacks two pieces at once. But the same idea can be executed with your queen or with other pieces, as we shall see. 2. A second type of double threat, and another family of tactical ideas, is the discovered attack. This occurs when you move one of your pieces out of the way of another so that both of them make separate attacks against your opponent. Again, he only has time to parry one of the threats. You play out the other one on your next move. 3. A third family of tactical ideas involves the pin or skewer. These occur when two of your opponent's pieces are on the same line and you place an attacker so that it runs through both of them. In effect, you again are making a double threat, one threat against the piece in front and another against the piece behind it. 4. And then there are countless other situations that may be lumped under the heading of removing the guard, in which you capture or harry an enemy piece that guards something else you want to take. Your opponent can't defend against both threats on the one turn allowed to him, so you are able to play one of them or the other. In effect, most games of chess are contests to see who can find a way to use one of those tactical techniques first. One successful fork, or discovery, or skewer, etc., often decides a game by giving one player an insurmountable advantage over the other. This is why Richard Teichmann said that chess is 99% tactics, and it is why mastery of tactics is the key to having fun at the chessboard, not to mention winning. Note, a fifth family of tactical operations involves mating patterns, characteristic ways that kings get trapped. These are treated in the last section of this site. They do not necessarily involve the logic of the double threat in the way that those tactical devices just described do. We also are leaving aside a few other, more minor families of tactics for now. Why it is important to identify loose pieces. The loose piece. Another key idea in chess is the loose piece. A loose piece is simply a piece that has no protection. It is common for players to leave pieces unprotected here and there. As long as they aren't being attacked, they look safe enough. But loose pieces make perfect targets for the double threats described a moment ago. Suppose your queen performs a fork, attacking your opponent's king and one of his rooks at the same time. He moves his king. Now you can use your queen to take his rook if it is unprotected. But if the rook is guarded, you won't be able to take it because the cost will be too high, your queen will be captured afterwards. We can turn this point into advice for practical play. You want to be aware of loose pieces on the board at all times. Any piece your opponent has left unguarded is a possible target for a tactical strike, any piece of yours that is left unguarded is a vulnerability. Indeed, you want to not only notice loose enemy pieces but also look for ways to create them. We will see countless examples in the studies to come. Loose pieces also can be defined to include enemy pieces that are underdefended, attacked once and defended once by a fellow piece. As we shall see, pieces in that condition sometimes can make targets just as good as pieces with no protection at all. The great chess writer Cecil Purdy stated the point as a rule: never leave or place a piece loose without first looking for a possible fork or pin, and never see an enemy piece loose without doing the same. Do you follow this advice already? Many inexperienced players don't. When they put a piece onto a new square, they mostly just check to make sure it won't get taken there. Purdy's advice is different. It is to ask whether your piece has protection on its new square, and if it doesn't, to ask carefully whether a fork or pin or other tactic might be launched against it. You may not yet understand quite what it means to look for forks or pins, but you will soon, and then following Purdy's counsel will save you many sorrows. What is a forced move? What is the best move? The forcing move. Sometimes in chess you do whatever you want to do and then your opponent does whatever he wants to do. Other times it's different. If you capture his knight with your bishop, for example, he pretty much has to recapture your bishop, otherwise he simply is short a piece and probably will lose. The other pieces belonging to both sides gradually will be exchanged away, and you will end up with the only attacking piece left on the board. Another example: if you check your opponent's king, he can't do whatever he wants in reply, he has to either move the king, block the check, or capture the piece you have used to make the threat. And if you make a move that will enable you to deliver checkmate on your next turn, a mating threat, your opponent likewise will have to address it immediately. Checks, captures, and mate threats therefore are known as forcing moves. In other words, they are moves that force your opponent to pick from a small set of possible replies. They are the essence of tactical chess. They allow you to dictate your opponent's moves and thus control how the board will look 2 or 3 or more moves from now. Other types of moves may be forcing as well, mind you. Any threat you make against your opponent, for example, a simple threat to take one of his pieces on your next move, may force him to reply in a certain way. This happens all the time, and we will see examples as we go. But checks, captures, and mate threats tend to be the most interesting and important kind of forcing moves because they so powerfully limit your opponent's choice of replies. This notion of forcing moves helps clear up some common confusions about chess. No doubt you have heard about good players seeing ahead 5 moves, or a dozen moves, or more. How do they do that when their opponents have so many possible responses to pick from? The usual answer is that their opponents don't have so many choices after all. Suppose I think like this: if I take your knight with my bishop, you will have to recapture my bishop, then if I check your king, you will have to move it over 1 square, then if I check your king on its new square, you will have to block my check, then your rook will be left loose and I will take it. In this case I have seen ahead 4 moves, but notice that I didn't have to keep track of a lot of possible variations. To each of my moves you only had one plausible reply. I just had to realize this. Of course sometimes your opponent will have more than one plausible reply, and in that case you will need to keep track of some variations. After all, if he does this, I'll do that, if he does the other thing, then I go to plan B, etc. And it's true that very strong players can keep straight lots of variations. But it's also true that a lot of great tactical sequences consist entirely of forced moves that make it not so hard to see ahead. Once you grasp the idea of forcing moves, it also is easier to understand how to come up with nifty tactical ideas during your games. Of course you might like to unleash a fork or discovery or skewer, but what if no such moves are possible when it's your turn? Do you wait around for a fork to become available? No. Your first job when you are deciding what move to play is to examine your possible forcing moves, any checks, captures, or mating threats you can offer. You don't look at these things just as ends in themselves, you ask what moves your opponent would be forced to make in reply, and whether you then would be able to play a fork or discovery or skewer or some other tactic. If the answer is no, you imagine playing another forcing move after the first one and then ask the same questions. The point of experimenting with forcing moves, in short, is that they change the look of the board. They may open up lines that currently are cluttered, they may cause your opponent to leave pieces loose that now have protection, they may make him line up pieces that are not now on the same line, they may make him put his king where it can be checked. Your task is to imagine the board as it would look after your forcing moves and see if changes such as those would create tactical openings for you. Gradually a pattern you recognize may emerge, the makings of a fork or discovery or other idea. With practice this becomes second nature. If your rook is aimed at your opponent's knight, you automatically consider capturing the knight and allowing your rook to be taken. This would be a sacrifice, of course, since rooks are more valuable than knights, but great tactical ideas routinely begin with sacrifices like that. The question is whether the exchange of your rook for his knight would leave you with a chance to play a fork or other double threat, or with a chance to play another forcing move that isn't yet possible. Maybe after your rook is captured you then can play a check that wasn't available before, and maybe after your opponent responds to the check you then will have a fork. But it all starts by thinking about a simple capture you can make and its consequences. Likewise, you generally don't want to make any moves without being aware of any checks you give and their consequences. Checks are the most forcing moves of all because your opponent is required to reply by moving his king, taking the piece that threatens it, or moving a piece between them. This usually makes it easy to see what a check will require your opponent to do. And since a check often forces your opponent to move his king, it may lead directly to tactics that make the king a target, a fork with the king at one end, or a pin with a king at the rear, or for that matter checkmate. Looking at any checks and captures you have to offer is like looking for loose pieces on the board. These are things you do all the time during a game, because most great tactical ideas involve one of those elements or the other. What is the difference between chess strategies and chess tactics? Strategy versus tactics. Often you will look at your forcing moves and decide they lead nowhere. That's fine, Now you instead play a strategic move rather than a tactical one, a move that improves the quality of your position without trying directly to win your opponent's pieces or mate his king. But strategy and tactics are linked, since one goal of strategic, positional play is to increase the power of your pieces and create fertile conditions for tactical strikes on later moves. Sometimes this is a matter of arranging your pieces so that they have more freedom of movement and denying the same freedoms to your opponent. Sometimes it is a matter of coordinating your pieces so that they are aimed at the same sector of the board. Sometimes it is a matter of arranging your pawns to help achieve those same purposes for your pieces. At the end of our study of each tactical family, and sometimes more often, we will pause to consider its strategic implications, what the tactical ideas teach about the right sorts of moves to play when there is no such tactic yet available. All this talk of weaponry admittedly is abstract. It will become concrete in the studies that follow. We will look at over 1,000 tactical sequences. The rough structure of most of these sequences, and of a large share of all the great tactical moves ever played in chess, is similar. It involves the elements just described. First, there are some forcing moves, checks or captures or mating threats that limit your opponent's replies. Then there is a denouement, a double threat, such as a fork or discovered attack or one of the other themes we will consider, that becomes possible after the forcing moves have changed the board. As a result, you are able to take a loose or underprotected enemy piece. We can call this a combination. The variations on this pattern are limitless, and there is much to know about its details, how to spot forcing moves and figure out their consequences, and how to spot the patterns suggesting that a fork or pin is in order. You can spend a lifetime building your understanding of those things and gaining skill at carrying them out under time pressure. But as you get started, it all may be more manageable if you consider these studies as variations on the single idea just described. The rest of this introductory section will be discussing chess notation and jargon, then some more technical aspects of the site. This therefore is a good time for a reminder that if you want to skip any or all of that stuff, perhaps because you already are comfortable reading about chess positions and want to cut right to some lessons, you can go back to the table of contents and navigate from there by using the link near the upper right corner of this screen. What is the value of chess pieces? The value of the pieces. This site assumes that you know how to play chess, in other words, how the pieces move. If you know that much, you probably also know which pieces are worth more than which. But to be on the safe side, it is conventional to rank the pieces in the following order of value, with points given to them as indicated to make it easier to work out whether a set of exchanges is favorable or unfavorable. Queen equals 9, rook equals 5, bishop equals 3, knight equals 3, pawn equals 1. What is the double attack? The double attack. The knight fork. Introduction. We begin our study of tactics with double attacks, or forks, moves that attack two enemy targets at once. And we begin our study of double attacks with knight forks. In the skeletal diagram to the left, white's knight has forked black's king and rook, in other words, it attacks them at the same time. Why start with the knight? Because it is an especially vicious and common forking tool. First, it can threaten a wide range of targets. The knight is roughly comparable in value to a bishop, and so is less valuable than a rook or queen, thus a knight not only can attack any unprotected, or loose, enemy pieces but also can be exchanged favorably for enemy queens and rooks regardless of whether they have protection. Second, the knight's unique, non-straight pattern of movement creates two advantages. It allows a knight to attack other pieces without fear of being captured by them, and it enables a knight to make jumps and deliver threats that are surprising to the eye and so are easy to overlook. To spot possible knight forks, you will want to become habitually aware of the relationships between your knights and your opponent's pieces, and between his knights and your pieces, especially as the knight progresses up the board. Every rank a knight moves forward tends to bring it closer to forking targets, especially the king. Notice that once your knight reaches its fourth rank, it can attack your opponent's back rank, and often his king, in one move. Thus in the diagram to the left, white's knight might have been on e4 a move earlier, seemingly pretty far from black's king. Hence the strategic importance of planting knights on central and advanced squares, and the tactical importance of constantly looking for forks your knight might be able to deliver once it is properly developed. What is chess notation? What is the best move? Notation, jargon, the look of the site, hard copies. Notation and jargon. This site makes every effort to explain everything in words, but when describing a series of chess moves it often is convenient to use abbreviations to describe them. Those abbreviations are known in chess as notation. This site generally uses the algebraic notation employed in most chess books, though with a small difference explained below. Despite the unpleasant label, it's very easy to understand. Most of it can be figured out as you read, but here is what you need to know about how it works. 1. Squares are named by their coordinates of 4, e5, h8, etc. These should be self-explanatory, since every diagram includes numbers running up the side of the board and letters along the bottom. The numbered horizontal rows are called ranks. The vertical columns named by letters are called files. 2 pieces are named by their first letter. Q equals queen, R equals rook, etc. The only exception is the knight, which is referred to as N to distinguish it from the king, K. Pawns are named by their squares, so that pawn from d4 moves to d5 means the pawn on d4 moves to d5. Sometimes in this book, and routinely in other books, a pawn move is described without bothering to name the square it came from. One simply says 1. d5, and everyone understands this means that the pawn on the d file moves to d5. 3 captures are described with an X between the names of the pieces capturing and being captured. So queen takes bishop means queen takes bishop, rook takes at a5 means the rook captures the pawn on a5, and pawn from h7 takes knight means the pawn on h7 captures the opposing knight. This last point is the way that the notation here varies from the usual algebraic notation in other books. Algebraic notation normally describes a capture by just referring to the square where it occurs. Thus if white's queen takes black's rook on the f6 square, most chess books would say queen takes at f6, but on this side we will say queen takes rook. The reason for the difference is that this side is meant primarily for people who haven't read other chess books before. As noted before, it's a chess book for people who don't like chess books, and for that audience the notation used here will be more intuitive. It's easy to understand that queen takes bishop means queen takes bishop, easy to imagine, and easy to find on the board. Queen takes at f6, however, has to be translated into queen takes bishop by looking at the board, finding f6, and seeing what piece is there. That's easy when you know instinctively where f6 is, but most readers of this project probably will find it faster to locate the bishop than to locate f6. The real benefits of naming captures by the squares where they occur come when describing long sequences, and few of the sequences here will be all that long. The approach used here is similar to the one used in Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess, a well-executed book for beginners. This approach to describing captures should be easy to follow for readers already used to ordinary algebraic notation. Anyone can understand what queen takes bishop means even if they are used to reading queen takes at f6. The gripe I anticipate from those who get worked up about these things is that if readers become used to this approach they will find it hard to read algebraic notation in other books. They will see, say, queen takes at f6 elsewhere and have trouble remembering that the other author means to say the queen captures whatever piece is on f6, not that the queen captures the f6 pawn, as it will mean here. I regard this as a trivial complaint. The reader of this side who does move on to other books should have no trouble making the transition if the above explanation is kept in mind, or just figuring it out on the fly, for this explanation makes the whole business sound more confusing than it is in practice. It's not that big a deal. For turning back to the notation rules, castling is indicated by writing 0 to 0, if it's on the side of the board where the king starts, or 0-0-0, if it's on the queen side, long castling, as it is called. 5. Now a couple of minor points that don't come up often, you probably don't need to worry about them, but for the sake of completeness, if a capture is made en passant, that's indicated by writing EP afterwards or some variant. I'm assuming you know what an en passant capture is, but if you don't, I'll explain it if it ever gets used here, and in the meantime you easily can find an explanation of it elsewhere on the web. Second, if one of your pawns reaches the opponent's back rank, it gets promoted to some other more powerful piece of your choice, usually the queen, though very occasionally some other choice works better. We indicate promotion with an equal sign. f7 pawn moves to f8 and is promoted to a queen means the pawn on f7 moves to f8 and becomes a queen. Again, I'll say more about this wherever it pops up. Finally, if more than one piece could be indicated by a description, in other words, if I refer to R but there are two rooks on the board and it's not obvious which one is meant, sometimes the coordinate of the piece will be given as well. So pawn from c8 takes knight means the rook on c8, not some other rook, captures the opponent's knight. Occasionally this approach also will be used just for clarity's sake, even if there is no technical reason for confusion. 6 sequences of moves are described in pairs, with the white move first. Thus a game might begin 1. Pawn from e2 moves to e4, pawn from e7 moves to e5 again. This could have been written 1. e4, e5, 2. Knight moves to f3, knight moves to c6, 3. Bishop moves to b5, pawn from a7 moves to a6, 4. Bishop takes knight, pawn from d7 takes bishop. This means that white started by moving his e-pawn forward 2 squares, and that black then did the same. Then on white's second turn he moved his knight to f3, and then black moved his knight to c6. White brought out his bishop. Black chased it with his pawn on the a-file. White replied by taking black's knight. Black recaptured with pawn on c6. The position on the left illustrates the result. When we look at positions from the middle of a game, as we generally will, we will describe white's first move in that position with the numeral 1, as something like 1. Knight moves to f5, for example. We call it 1 because it's the first move in the pictured position, even though it's not the first move in the game. If we want to start by describing a move of black's, we do it by saying something like, black can play 1, knight moves to f5. The 1 followed by the 3 dots indicates that we're looking at the first pair of moves in the position, but that we're starting with the second half of the pair, in other words, with black's move. 7. A plus sign after a move, like this, rook moves to h8, check, means that the move checks the enemy king. A hashtag sign after a move, like this, rook moves to h8, checkmate, means that the move is checkmate, or simply mate, as we more commonly say. 8. It often happens that a player can sacrifice a knight or bishop to win an enemy rook. Since rooks are more valuable than knights or bishops, a player who does this is said to have won the exchange. If we reach a stage of the game where I have, say, a bishop and a rook and you have a bishop and a knight, I am said to be ahead the exchange. 9. A piece is said to be loose if it has no defenders. It is hanging if it is exposed to capture. You hang your queen if you leave it where your opponent can take it for free. This also is known as leaving a piece en prise. What is the knight fork? The double attack. The knight fork. Introduction. We begin our study of tactics with double attacks, or forks, moves that attack two enemy targets at once. And we begin our study of double attacks with knight forks. In the skeletal diagram to the left, white's knight has forked black's king and rook, in other words, it attacks them at the same time. Why start with the knight? Because it is an especially vicious and common forking tool. First, it can threaten a wide range of targets. The knight is roughly comparable in value to a bishop, and so is less valuable than a rook or queen, thus a knight not only can attack any unprotected, or loose, enemy pieces but also can be exchanged favorably for enemy queens and rooks regardless of whether they have protection. Second, the knight's unique, non-straight pattern of movement creates two advantages. It allows a knight to attack other pieces without fear of being captured by them, and it enables a knight to make jumps and deliver threats that are surprising to the eye and so are easy to overlook. To spot possible knight forks, you will want to become habitually aware of the relationships between your knights and your opponent's pieces, and between his knights and your pieces, especially as the knight progresses up the board. Every rank a knight moves forward tends to bring it closer to forking targets, especially the king. Notice that once your knight reaches its fourth rank, it can attack your opponent's back rank, and often his king, in one move. Thus in the diagram to the left, white's knight might have been on e4 a move earlier, seemingly pretty far from black's king. Hence the strategic importance of planting knights on central and advanced squares, and the tactical importance of constantly looking for forks your knight might be able to deliver once it is properly developed. White to move. What is the best move? The difficulty in fashioning a fork, of course, is that no matter where your knight sits you rarely will find a fork lying one move away against a decent player. Leaving two pieces to be forked by a knight on the next move is a blunder almost as bad as leaving a piece hanging outright. Forks have to be manufactured, the challenge is to see when one lies a few steps away. Fortunately, knight forks a few steps away come in a finite number of types that you can learn to search for systematically and, with practice, recognize quickly. Such situations can be sorted into two general types. First, sometimes two of your opponent's pieces sit on squares that can be forked with one move of your knight, but there is some obstacle to your taking advantage of this. Most commonly, the square your knight needs to reach, call it the forking square, is defended by your opponent. The diagram to the left shows such a case. Again in skeletal form, white would like to play the fork, knight moves to f6, check, but he can't. The f6 square is defended by a pawn. We will refer to these as cases where you have a potential fork, a move that amounts to a fork on its face, but that needs to be perfected by overcoming some defensive measure that your opponent has in place. In a moment we will catalog those defensive measures and how to deal with them. White to move. What is the best move? Second, sometimes you will not have even a potential fork because your opponent's pieces are not arranged for it. There are no two enemy pieces that your knight can attack in one move. Thus in the diagram to the left, white cannot deliver a fork, but he could if he were able to get black's king to move over a square onto g8. In cases like this it sometimes is possible to draw enemy pieces onto forkable squares with some forcing moves, most often with a check or two. Later we will consider the clues that such possibilities for manipulation may exist and how they can be brought to fruition. White to move. What is the best move? Seeing potential forks. Let's begin with ways of perfecting potential forks, in other words, cases where your opponent starts with two pieces that at least are on forkable squares. The first important thing is to see all such forks in the first place. It helps to start by learning to spot all of a knight's possible moves at a glance. For this purpose you will want a clear mental picture of the ring of 8 squares that are the maximum to which a well-placed knight can move. In the diagram on the left, the white circles show squares where the white knight can jump, and the black circles show squares where the horribly positioned black knight can jump. Now you can understand why having your knight near the edge of the board generally is bad policy. It can't reach and thus can't control many squares from there. Study these visual patterns so that seeing a knight's moves from any position comes easily to you. Black to move. What is the best move? Now to the matter of spotting knight forks in particular. You may be used to certain forking patterns. Your opponent's king and rook are a square apart on his back rank, inviting you to fork them. But it takes more care never to overlook a potential fork when the board is crowded and the pieces to be forked are not lined up so neatly on the same row. Consider the opportunities here for black's knight on b7. By moving to c5 it can fork 4 white pieces, find them. By moving to d6 it can fork 2 pieces. Whether either of these forks work is another question. The squares the knights need are guarded, though black has possible replies, etc., but don't worry about that now. It's just an exercise in geometry. We want to see every place where 2 white pieces are in a forkable position. Seeing only the obvious forking candidates is no good, and won't lead to tactical magic. If they are obvious your opponent can see them, too, and can avoid them. You want to see all of the possibilities every time they exist. Notice an important feature of the knight's movements: every time a knight moves it lands on a different colored square. This can be used to make your searching more efficient. It means that 2 pieces can be forked by a knight only if they are on squares of the same color. It means that they only can be forked by a knight that lands on a square of the opposite color, and it therefore means that if a knight is in position to deliver a fork on its next move, the knight and its targets must all then be sitting on squares of the same color. This is a valuable idea. Consider it a law of knight forks. To state the practical implication plainly, one way to build your ability to see all the potential knight forks on the board is to look for any 2 pieces of your opponents that are on squares of the same color as the square where your knight sits. If, as in this case, your knight is on a light square, scan the board for pieces of your opponents also on light squares. Can any 2 of them be forked by your knight? This only takes a moment. You aren't yet analyzing whether any of the forks would work, but just are reviewing the board visually for simple patterns, a color scan. Sometimes this will be a helpful way to alert yourself to forking opportunities. In other positions it will be more efficient just to look directly at your knight moves without reference to square color. Experiment. White to move. What is the best move? As you do your scanning you will discover certain additional laws of knight moves that will become part of your visual vocabulary. An important example is that 2 pieces can't be forked if they are on the same diagonal with 1 square between them. Thus the black king and queen in the diagram to the left are on squares of the same color, but there is no square from which a knight would be able to attack them both. This is a familiar pattern, and when you see it you will not need to pause to think about whether a knight fork is in the immediate offing. The sight of it will be self-explanatory, and you will move on. Similarly, if your knight is on the same diagonal as an enemy piece and separated from it by one square, the knight is 3 moves away from being able to attack the piece. Thus in the diagram the white knight is 3 moves from being able to attack the black king. It must move, say, to e4, then to g5, then to e6. Another useful thing to know is that a knight may be able to attack an enemy target 2 different ways but never more than 2. In the diagram, for example, white's knight can attack the black rook by moving to e4 or d5, and only the latter move creates a fork. This is useful to remember because the first attacking idea you see with your knight may turn out not to be the best one even against the same enemy piece. Practice broad-mindedness when you scan for forking prospects. It is especially important not to dismiss a possible fork automatically, perhaps half-consciously, when you notice that the square your knight needs is protected by a pawn, or when you see that the fork would involve your opponent's king on the one hand but a knight or protected pawn on the other. In the latter case you might quickly imagine that if you tried the fork the enemy would move his king and the pawn would not be worth taking, and so write off the forking prospect without taking it seriously. But that train of thought is premature. Great combinations often look just that way at first. You want to separate the creative process of seeing that the geometry is there for a fork from the editing process of analyzing whether the fork can be made profitable. Much of the rest of this chapter is devoted to the editing process, how to take potential forks that look defective and turn them into tactical shots that work. But all along you also want to build the visual habit of noticing every time your knight can attack 2 sensitive points at once, no matter how implausible the attack looks at first.